Yes, got it. There we go. Once again, good morning, good afternoon. My name is John Devadas. Thank you, Ramesh, for the very kind introduction. I'm a platform guy. I've worked on platforms all my professional career. I've built platforms targeting millions and tens of millions of developers. So I want to give you the perspective of a platform builder in terms of how I see blockchains. And I hope this will be of benefit to you, whether you work in the enterprise blockchain sector or the crypto consumer sector or somewhere in between. I titled this the first economic platforms in the history of computing. So I'll walk you through a bit of a storyline and my own story as well. And hopefully, this will be clearer in the coming few slides. So let me jump in. I want to just pause maybe for a few minutes to look back at computing platforms. And you might say, well, what the heck is a computing platform? And so I went to Wikipedia. And Wikipedia says a computing platform, of course, you can read this, is an environment, et cetera, right? It could be software, could be hardware, could be OS, all the way in between. But you get the idea in terms of how we think about computing platforms. Now, when we look back at previous computing platforms, and I will date myself here. In fact, the very first computing platform I was able to work on as a student was on the IBM mainframes, and I had to learn programming on punch card systems. So I look back at the history of computing, going back to mainframes through PCs, the client server wave in the late 80s, early 90s, of course, the web, or what you might call the internet back in the late 90s, SOA, early 2000s, the so-called Web 2.0, probably early to maybe mid 2000s, the cloud, of course, which we're all very familiar with, and more recently, decentralized databases and ledgers. Now, you might say, why do I have this laundry list of what you might call previous computing platforms? Well, if you look at them, there is a consistent, constant theme. I will argue that the recurring theme or pattern is one of plumbing. You see storage and you see compute, you see networking, bandwidth. But this is all passive, inert. And what do I mean by saying it's passive, inert? The platform just sits there. It doesn't do anything unless and until you kick in and you write some code and you say start, or you say stop, or something all the way in between. It is truly infrastructure. Even the cloud, Azure, or Amazon Web Services, right? It just sits there. It doesn't do anything, unless and until you kick in as a developer, as a builder, or some other role to light it up. So I want to keep this mental model for you of platforms historically as being plumbing infrastructure, which requires somebody to light them up, if you will. Looking forward at blockchains, or rather looking today and looking out a bit as well in terms of blockchains. Now, what are we building on blockchains? Look at Bitcoin. Is Bitcoin an application? Truly, is it an application? Now you look at a Zoom, right? Zoom, you start, you stop, or an Excel, or a PowerPoint, or a, or even a PC or a Mac, right? The apps are under your control. Is Bitcoin truly under your control? Not really. And so I argue, my case is that what we are building on blockchains are not really applications, that we are building institutions. Now you might say, what the heck is an institution? To me, it means a few things. Self-governing. Once again, there is no start or a stop for a Bitcoin or an Ethereum. It just runs, right? So the self-governance, the self-regulation, the self-perpetuating aspect of, whatever you want to call it, but to me, this is an institution. And so when we think of these as institutions, not as vanilla classic applications, then what is the nature of the underlying platform, the stack that you need that you require to be able to truly build institutions and not applications. And again, I want to pause because look, if you're building an application, you're totally fine using any of the previous waves, including, of course, today's cloud. It doesn't matter. But if you are building something akin to a Bitcoin or an Ethereum, then none of the existing platforms, or even if you're building an app on top of it, you're building a DAO or a DeFi app or some other smart contract based institution, the existing platforms do not serve the job anymore for you. So this is my thesis, which I want to present to you, that we are seeing a fundamental shift, a true disruption in terms of what computing platforms mean to us as developers, as software engineers, as computer scientists. This shift from computing platform to economic platforms. Now, why do I term this an economic platform? Because in these stacks, in these platforms, intrinsically, innately, there are economic or crypto-economic protocols baked in, intrinsically. There is no overlay, there is no add-on. And so incentives, of course, primarily economic incentives or penalties are baked inside. Historically, when you have built IT applications or consumer applications, elements like compliance and governance and so on have been overlays, add-ons. You have busloads of consultants, you spend millions, maybe billions of dollars on ensuring or attempting to ensure compliance or governance. Now, what is so different about these economic platforms is this is all in-band because of the intrinsic economic protocols. And so aspects like verification, validation, they happen intrinsically. There is no add-on overlay, bringing people, bringing processes. It's either there or it's not. And this is, I think, the magic of what you might call a blockchain platform. Now, you might say, okay, fine. Whether you buy my hypothesis or not, you might say there is something there. So these are truly economic platforms, right? Fundamentally different for the first time in the history of computing. Then what are the implications? Well, for me, a very clear implication is that economic platforms require economic architectures. Now we are truly building, again, on the shoulders of giants. Not to disparage, the past, we build on what they have built previously. Now, as architects, as developers, as computer scientists, we are familiar with notions like application architecture or infrastructure architecture or technology or even enterprise architecture. But what has been lacking, what is still lacking, is the notion of economic architectures. Because if these are truly economic platforms, then ergo, you require economic architectures. Now, what is this, you might say? Well, in the consumer crypto world, often referred to as tokenomics. I'm sure you're familiar with the term, you've heard it, right? I argue tokenomics is another term for an economic architecture and the underlying incentives, penalties, and more. Now, what is the same in the enterprise world? It is my experience currently, in having spent 20, 25 years in the enterprise world, I argue once again that it is the lack of this economic architecture that is holding back the success of blockchain platforms in the enterprise world. Not being able to understand, to optimize, to exploit the economic architecture, the enterprise world is still sees blockchains as ledgers, as databases, possibly even decentralized databases, but not beyond. And this is why I make my case that in the world of enterprise blockchain, people are still struggling to show. They come to me and say, John, I have a pilot or a proof of concept, but I'm not seeing the ROI. Well, clearly, if there is no underlying economic architecture, you most definitely will not see the ROI. So a key takeaway, if you buy this premise, then that economic architectures are required. Now you might say, okay, great. I've given you a bit of history, the history of computing platforms going back 60, 70 years. I make my case that what we see right now in front of us is a fundamentally different kind of platform computing. This requires economic architectures. Then you might say, okay, what next? Where do we go next? Well, and this is why I want to pause, because incentives are great. Economic models, economics, talks about incentives, but we know in terms of society, in terms of our communities, in terms of the world does not run purely on economic incentives. Some people might think so, but I think broadly you'd agree with me that concepts like altruism and brotherhood and community, these are not based on purely economic incentives. They cannot be. And so whilst we are seeing the advent of economic platforms, I believe really what is next and where I would like to see the innovation, what I would like to see the focus of our community is around what I call, or what I think of as socioeconomic platforms. Because platforms, a world running purely on economic incentives, I think leads us to a very dystopian future. And so whilst we see true disruptive innovation, I want to challenge, I want to make the case that let's step back, let's take what is good here, and let's really think about what this means to take the incentives beyond purely economic to socioeconomic incentives. And with that, I want to stop. I want to pause. If there are any questions, comments, that's a very brief talk. I want to give you a bit of history, a hypothesis, an implication, and then a challenge in terms of where I believe we should go next. So let me stop right there and see if there are any questions, comments, any feedback.
There's one comment, John. You
Yes.
can see from Gora.
Yes, that's right. You can't blame me for .NET Gora if you did not like it. Yes, guilty as charged. Yes.
It's the other way around. We spent my first 20 years of my life just living in that world.
Well, then in that case, I need to catch up with you over a few beers then. I did not know you had spent time in that particular world, so I'm looking forward to that.
So taking up on that, the platform aspect of blockchain as new developers are coming in, haven't we confused the people by having so many choice that use this brown bread? No, use this white bread, use this wheat bread. I'm purposefully not naming any of the existing solutions, but you get my drift.
Yes.
I'm a new developer. I want to get into blockchain. Okay, what do I install? I mean, what do I do? Which IDE do I get?
So that's a really good question, and I'm glad you asked the question. I'll respond in two parts. So part one, yes, you're right in terms of almost like this buffet of tools and stacks, and you might call platforms out there. You're right. There is a distinct lack of guided experiences to help new developers, and I think you're right. Very much a free for all because different chains do it in different ways. But the second part of it, I would say, I think where you hit the nail on the head, Gora, is much like the early days of computer science. The emergence of design patterns, I would argue, is what changed the game with the discipline and the repeatability and the predictability. And I think in the blockchain space, we are yet to truly see the codification of blockchain design patterns. What happened in the late 90s with the first design patterns book, changed how we think about programming and writing code in terms of C++ and beyond. And I see this huge opportunity, which you're right, that lacking codified blockchain design patterns, the domain is still early. With that said, I'm certainly, working on this space. If there are other people, including yourself, Gora, that we can bring together to codify. We don't have to create. We have to just collate and codify and then document, which I think will be of yeoman service to young and especially newer developers in this space.
Thanks for that excellent answer.
Thank you. The question is spot on. I'm glad you asked the question. Thank you.
John, this statement you have here is, I guess the words socioeconomic platforms, like it kind of sounds like DAO. I mean, could you like clarify? I mean,
Yes.
obviously DAO is not a platform. It's more of just a program that's smart contracts running on a platform. So yeah.
No, again, I'm glad, Ramesh, that's a really, really good question. Thank you. Yes, you're right. Because with the emergence of DAOs, I think you're right. We are seeing the shift towards what you might say beyond vanilla economic incentives. Now, you're right. We could see DAOs basically as a collection of smart contracts. Personally, I like to think of DAOs as kind of experiments with respect to socioeconomic computing, that we are experimenting in terms of how we might collaborate, how we share, how we communicate, and especially around things like governance and voting and so on. So I do see significant potential there. I'm certainly very much a long-term believer in the ideas of DAOs. Now, with that said, I think where we are right now with DAOs maybe is still very much the experimentation phase. And I'd welcome, obviously, any thoughts, any collaboration if there are folks listening or who might watch the session later as well.
So if I were to simplify, what you're saying is like it's the economics plus values that basically creates communities, and these platforms would enable that kind of community building. And then if we say that, then what do you think about all these communities built around different blockchains? There's all kinds of people on, like, for example, any ecosystem you pick, traders and like people building all kinds of stuff. So how is that different than what you're referring here? Like, for example, there's an Ethereum ecosystem, right? Or Solana, there's all kinds of people are part of that ecosystem, right?
Yes, so really good question. I would say I think the two words you mentioned are quite appropriate: community and then ecosystem. Personally, I think much of what goes on with respect to these chains, as you said, are ecosystems. Ecosystems, or what you might call networks of either individuals or organizations coming together to be able to ensure the longevity of that particular chain and the ecosystem. I still believe that much of this is around economic incentives, and rightfully so, because that's what drives, obviously, innovation, progress, drives disruption, rightfully so. No argument, and certainly, no disrespect to the economic incentive models. However, as we said, your point around values, I think is very, very appropriate. When we think about society, beyond economic incentives, how do we codify? Frankly, I don't know. I don't have an answer, but I think you also mentioned DAOs early on, right? And we are looking, right, as people, as individuals, as human beings, I think we are striving to look beyond what we can see as certainly good, but inadequate, I think, to be able to reflect the nature of who we are as human beings, in my opinion.
Thank you. Let's see, any other questions, comments?
Not yet, but I can ask another one while people are typing or raising their hand. John, do you want to talk a little bit about the early days of programming when you said, we had these various tools or platforms which came about, but what really pushed the envelope there wasn't really the platform, but the perceived notion of certificates, and if I get this certificate in this, and then I'll have a value for my next job.
Yes, very true. That's a good point. You're like, yes, and I think back in the early days, .NET, even before .NET, you had people like the Cisco's and the others, having this entire, you might say, ecosystem based on certifications. You're right, in terms of professional, credit, and certainly with respect to professional career growth. I think in the blockchain space, in my opinion, my humble opinion, we haven't seen that in a significant way yet, because I think, my opinion, that the enterprise world is yet to see blockchains as economic stacks. They're still very much engrossed with this decentralization and the database and the ledger aspect, which is only half the coin, only half the story at best. And I think to crack this puzzle in the enterprise, we're going to have new thinking, fundamentally new thinking, which says, what is my economic architecture? I work with some very large enterprise companies around the world. I'm yet to see truly people having a first-class perspective. There are some, but truly across the space in terms of economic architectures. And lacking that, what are we building? We're building applications. We're not building institutions. And until we cross that bridge, I think, unfortunately, Gaurav, we're going to be kind of slow going on the enterprise side. On the consumer side, of course, it's very different, right? Like Ramesh said around DAOs and push the envelope, as you said, with respect to new thinking, new ideas, new patterns. The patterns are there. They're emerging. They are there. I think the challenge is the patterns have not been codified and collated for the benefit of the larger community, in my opinion.
Yeah, it reminds me of the UML design pattern book.
Yes, that's right. we need something like that, right? It's overdue.
Exactly. So
Right.
there's a question on the chat. We're going to address that.
Yes, you're right. That's a very relevant question. And I think you're right, Razvan, that there is the natural, leading off into political and other implications, because governance obviously is the underlying theme. And what we are grappling with these emerging DAOs around governance. People talk about voting, but voting really is about governance, which, like you said, leads on to political ramifications. So I would certainly I would certainly hope so as well. In fact, today is the election day in the US, by the way.
And yesterday we had a speaker, Aidan Slavin from the World Economic Forum. He was talking about the DAO governance work that they're doing. And they're trying to educate the policymakers and people at Davos on governance aspect of DAOs and things like that. Yeah.
That's a really good signs, I think, right? Collectively, that people are moving beyond sort of the infrastructure parts. Now we're talking about other kinds of incentives, about governance, about political implications. So I certainly see it all as very positive news, for what we are building together as a community. Thank you, Razvan. That was a very good question.
Sounds good. So I think, thank you, John. Thanks for joining. We will make this recording available to the attendees. Anything else, Cora?
Yes, just to expand on that, all recording from all sessions will be made available through a value attendee registration. We will be sending out an email to folks who can go ahead and use that. And I'll put that in the chat as well, so that you know what I'm talking about. Here it is. We have an enormous amount of information, or rather video recordings we are collecting. So there's a very, very, very small fee to access all the recording for the 5 days, 12 hours a day almost of sessions. So, with that, John, thank you very much for an excellent simulating discussion. And just as a thought for you, we have a very rich community which have come together because of this. Maybe we have 2,000 interested folks around the globe who are coming together. Maybe we can have a community looking into developing a platform. Some of the things we discussed today which are missing.
That would be wonderful. I like your idea, definitely. I'm very happy to follow up with you on this one. Once again, I want to thank you. Thank you, Gaurav. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you, Ramesh, for giving me this time as well. Much appreciated.
All right, folks. With that, we conclude this session. Let me stop the recording.